Let me ask you something simple, but strangely heavy. When was the last time you actually felt your birthday? Not just said thanks to a few messages, not just smiled at a cake photo, but felt it. The way you did when you were a kid. You remember, right? That small electric buzz in your chest the night before. That almost sacred feeling that tomorrow, for once, was about you. The balloons, the attention, the noise, even if it was messy or awkward, it still meant something. And then somewhere along the line, that feeling just disappeared. Now it's just another day. You wake up, maybe get a text from your mum, maybe a HBD from someone you haven't spoken to in years. You thank them politely, close your phone and go back to work, pretending it doesn't sting. You tell people you don't really celebrate anymore. You say it's not a big deal. You say, it's just another day. But deep down, you kind of know that's not the whole truth. Because the thing is, people who treat their birthday like a normal day aren't cold or emotionless or detached. They're often the ones who feel the most. They've just learned how to hide it better. They've learned that expectations can hurt. That excitement, if it's met with silence, burns twice. And after enough of those birthdays that didn't quite live up to something, the mind quietly adapts. It starts lowering the bar, not because it doesn't care anymore, but because caring has started to cost too much. That's the quiet psychology behind it. What looks like indifference is often emotional self-protection, a small defense mechanism wrapped in calmness. It says, if I don't expect anything, I can't be disappointed. And while that sounds sad, it's not weakness, it's survival. It's your mind trying to protect your peace, because when you've been let down enough times, by people forgetting, by plans falling through, by the day feeling hollow, your brain starts choosing stability over surprise. It's emotional minimalism. You strip away the noise to keep yourself safe. But here's where it gets tricky. That same protection that shields you from disappointment also numbs joy. The walls you build to stop the pain, they block the light too, and slowly, without realizing it, you start walking through your own life like a guest at someone else's party. Polite, composed, present but distant, and that's what's so quietly heartbreaking about it. It's not that people stop wanting to be celebrated, they just stop believing it'll feel good when they are. Because somewhere along the way, the excitement turned into a reminder of who didn't show up, of what changed, of how time keeps moving whether anyone notices or not. So they smile and shrug and say, it's fine, but deep down they still check who remembered, because even pretending not to care is still a form of caring. Here's the thing most people miss. Birthdays aren't just dates, they're mirrors, tiny emotional mirrors that quietly reflect how we feel about being alive, how we relate to attention, how comfortable we are with being seen. When someone says, I don't care about my birthday, they might mean one of two things. Either they've genuinely found peace and simplicity, or they've learned to protect themselves from caring too much. Because at some point, excitement turned risky. Maybe they planned something once and nobody showed up. Maybe people forgot. Maybe it just never felt the way it used to. And the brain, being what it is, adaptive, defensive, learns a quiet lesson. Let's not do that again. Psychologists call it emotional self-protection. You start lowering your expectations, not because you've grown cold, but because hope has started to hurt. It's like the mind saying, don't hope too loud. It echoes when no one answers. And in that silence, something happens. The heart starts wrapping itself in layers, calmness, independence, maturity. But underneath, there's still that small child, the one who once counted down the days with a grin, waiting for someone to say, we're so glad you exist. That part never really leaves. It just gets quieter. And that quiet is what adulthood feels like sometimes. Not emptiness, but a soft withdrawal. Not, I don't care, but I care in private now. And it's not always a bad thing, because some people truly outgrow the need for external celebration. They find peace in ordinary days, in routines, in quiet gratitude. They stop chasing validation and start noticing meaning in small things like making breakfast for themselves or watching light spill across the floor in the morning. To them, life itself becomes the celebration. They've learned that joy doesn't need to be scheduled. It's not about a calendar date, it's about presence. But for others, the story is different. For them, birthdays are quietly complicated. They bring up a strange mix of emotions, nostalgia, anxiety, reflection, even a little ache, not because of age, but because of memory, because somewhere deep inside, the day still carries weight. A part of you still expects something, even if it's small, even if you pretend you don't. You still glance at your phone, you still notice who texted and who didn't. And then you tell yourself, it's fine, but it lingers anyway. That's the paradox of it. You can tell yourself it doesn't matter 1,000 times, but the heart keeps score in its own quiet way. And maybe that's what birthdays reveal most clearly. The tension between wanting to be seen and not wanting to need it. It's a strange, almost invisible tug of war inside us, between independence and connection, between peace and longing, between I'm okay on my own and I still hope someone remembers. And most of us live somewhere in that middle space, half content, half yearning, pretending not to care, but secretly wishing someone would look past the pretense. Because even the calmest souls, the ones who say, it's just another day, still crave the feeling of being quietly seen, not praised, not celebrated loudly, just acknowledged. A simple, hey, I'm glad you exist. That's all most people really want. And that's what makes the psychology of it so quietly human. It's not about avoiding emotion, it's about balancing it, keeping joy small enough to be safe, but still big enough to matter. There's this strange thing that happens around birthdays. Even if you say you don't care, even if you go to work, scroll a bit and move on, somewhere deep in your mind, a clock ticks louder that day. You can't help but notice it. It's subtle, a quiet awareness that another year has passed. And that awareness, whether you admit it or not, makes you look back for a second. Psychologists call it temporal self-awareness. It's when you unconsciously measure the distance between who you were and who you've become. And sometimes that distance feels satisfying, sometimes it doesn't. That's why for some people, birthdays feel like celebrations, markers of progress, proof that they've grown, evolved, survived. But for others, birthdays feel like mirrors they'd rather not look into. Not because they hate getting older, but because that mirror reflects questions they don't want to face. What did I actually do this year? Am I where I thought I'd be? Did I change at all or just move in circles? Those questions don't need answers. They just hang there quiet and heavy. And sometimes the easiest way to avoid them is to treat the day like any other. That's not denial. That's self-preservation. Because reflection is exhausting, especially when it collides with expectation. When the world says, you should be happy today, but your heart says, I just want space to think. So you tell people you're fine, you smile, you blend into your routine. But inside, the mind is busy. It's scrolling through memories like an old photo album. The laughter, the loneliness, the goals that changed, the people who drifted. It's almost like your subconscious is taking inventory, not of things, but of time, of how much of it has passed quietly and how much of it you've truly lived. And in that quiet audit, something shifts. You realize that birthdays aren't really about age. They're about awareness, about pausing, even for a moment, and noticing your own existence. Some people run from that awareness, others sit with it, but both are valid, because growth doesn't always look like celebration. Sometimes it looks like silence. And that silence isn't emptiness, it's integration. It's your mind saying, I'm still processing everything I've been through. Because sometimes the most meaningful reflections don't come with candles and wishes. They come quietly, in the way you look at yourself in the mirror that morning and just whisper, still here. That's the real psychology behind birthdays as adults. They stop being about being celebrated and start being about being aware. Because once you've lived enough, lost enough, loved enough, learned enough, you realize that time itself is the party, and you're lucky just to be invited. Here's where it gets interesting, because on the surface, people who say, I don't care about my birthday, look calm, collected, almost evolved. But underneath that calm, there's usually a quiet duality, peace and longing living side by side. They've learned how to be okay without attention. They've learned how to find meaning in solitude. But that doesn't mean they've stopped wanting to be seen. It just means they no longer expect it. And that difference between not needing and not expecting is subtle but huge. See, emotional maturity often comes with side effects. When you become self-sufficient, when you stop relying on others for happiness, you also start feeling a little disconnected from the idea of being celebrated. Not because you don't deserve it, but because you don't know how to receive it anymore. You tell yourself it's fine, that attention makes you uncomfortable, that you prefer it quiet, but part of that is just fatigue, the kind that comes from years of giving, from holding things together for everyone else, from being the strong one who doesn't ask for much. So when your birthday comes and people say, "What are you doing to celebrate?" you say, "Nothing really." But maybe what you really mean is, "I don't know how to let myself be celebrated anymore." Because celebration feels vulnerable. It's attention, it's exposure, it's the spotlight turning toward you. And if you've spent your life being the one who shines it on others, that light suddenly feels blinding. So instead, you stay small. You make the day simple. You tell yourself it's peace, and in many ways, it is. But it's also a little lonely. That's the paradox of emotional evolution. You learn to love yourself quietly. You learn to be whole alone. But at the same time, a part of you still misses being surprised, being remembered without reminding, being celebrated without asking. That small ache doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're still human. Because even the most independent souls still want warmth, still want to be seen, not for achievements, not for being strong, but just for existing. And when that doesn't happen, you don't fall apart. You just carry on. You pour that energy into others. You show up for their days. You remember their milestones. Because it feels easier to give than to receive. And over time, that becomes your pattern. You turn other people's celebrations into the place where your joy lives. But beneath that, beneath all the calm, the self-awareness, the quiet independence, there's still a small voice that whispers, "I hope someone remembers." Not with balloons, not with grand gestures, but with something simple, a text, a call, a few words that say, "You matter." Because what we really crave on days like that isn't celebration, it's connection. It's proof that our existence still registers somewhere in the world. Think about this. When we were kids, birthdays were simple. You didn't question whether you deserved attention, you just expected it. The day came and you were the center of it. No guilt, no overthinking, just pure, unfiltered joy. But as we grow up, that starts to change. Somewhere between childhood and adulthood, the spotlight stops feeling warm and starts feeling awkward. You start second-guessing the attention. You start saying things like, "You don't have to do anything for me," or "It's really not a big deal." But where did that come from? That instinct to downplay yourself? That subtle discomfort with being seen? For a lot of people, it starts early. When you grow up being the reliable one, the giver, the helper, the one who keeps things together, you learn that your joy comes second, that your needs are negotiable, that it's easier to take care of everyone else than to risk being disappointed when they don't take care of you. So by the time adulthood hits, you're fluent in self-denial. You're good at being the one who remembers other people's birthdays, the one who plans, who checks in, who shows up, and when your own day comes around, you brush it off, not out of strength but out of habit. You tell yourself you don't want attention, but deep down you just don't trust it. You've learned that it fades fast, that sometimes people remember out of obligation, not love. And rather than risk that hollow feeling, you stay safe behind indifference. That's not immaturity, it's conditioning. It's what happens when love has felt unpredictable, when affection came with strings, or when silence hurt less than disappointment. So now when someone says, "It's just another day," what they often mean is, "I've made peace with not being the priority," and that peace comes with a quiet cost. Because even though you've learned to live without the noise, some part of you still craves that old simplicity, that childlike permission to feel excited without irony, to feel important just for being here. But the world doesn't really give adults that space. We're told to be humble, grounded, practical, to act like celebration is childish. So we start confusing humility with invisibility. We call it maturity, but sometimes it's just fatigue wearing a wise face. And it's strange, because even as we grow more self-aware, that small ache doesn't disappear. It just hides behind all the right words, behind, "I'm good, and it's fine, and I don't need much." But every now and then, someone remembers. Someone sends a message that feels real. And for a second, you feel that flicker again, that warmth that says, "I'm still here, I still matter," and that's when you realize you never stopped caring, you just stopped admitting it. Here's the part that fascinates psychologists, how the mind quietly rewires itself to keep you safe. See, when you've been let down enough times, when people forget, when plans fall apart, when excitement turns into disappointment, your brain starts to make adjustments, not consciously but instinctively. It's called emotional self-protection. Your nervous system learns the pattern, hope into letdown into being hurt, so it starts cutting out the first step. No hope, no hurt. Simple. Efficient. The brain doesn't care about happiness, it cares about balance, so it lowers the emotional peaks to avoid the valleys. It trades euphoria for equilibrium, and in theory, that sounds healthy, until you realize it also dampens joy. Because you can't selectively numb feelings. When you shut down disappointment, you dull excitement too. When you stop hoping, you stop feeling the full color of anything. That's why people who treat their birthdays like normal days often describe a kind of emotional flatness. Not sadness, not depression, just quiet. They're not cold, they're calibrated. Their brain has learned to keep things even, stable, predictable. But stability has a cost, because even though it protects you, it also isolates you. You start walking through life like a guest at your own event, polite, observant, but detached. You smile at the cake, thank the people who texted, but you don't really feel any of it. It's like watching a version of yourself from the outside. And maybe that's what emotional fatigue looks like. Not tears, not breakdowns, just quiet distance. A muted version of what used to feel electric. But here's the twist. That defense mechanism, the one that shields you, it's not trying to kill your joy. It's trying to protect your peace. It's the mind's way of saying, you've had enough of the ups and downs. Let's keep it neutral. And while that sounds wise, it can slowly start to dull your aliveness. Because balance isn't always peace. Sometimes it's just suppression with good branding. There's a fine line between emotional regulation and emotional withdrawal, and birthdays often show you which side you're on. If you feel calm, grounded, content, that's peace. But if you feel numb, if you say, it's just another day, and there's a faint ache behind it, that's your brain's quiet defense at work. It's not something to shame or fix, it's just something to notice. Because once you see it, you realize the mind isn't trying to rob you of joy. It's just afraid of what joy costs. But here's the truth that often gets lost. You can handle disappointment now. You're not that child anymore. You can feel things fully and still survive them. And maybe, just maybe, it's okay to let a little excitement back in. Even if it's small, even if it's just lighting a candle for yourself, not because it's your birthday, but because you made it.